Picture this, a perfect, sun-drenched island all your own, powder white beaches, turquoise waters, and total seclusion. It's the ultimate fantasy, a symbol of unimaginable wealth and escape. For the mega rich of the Gilded Age and royalty with fortunes to burn, buying a private island wasn't just a purchase, it was a statement. It meant you had reached a level of power where you could literally carve out your own world, far from prying eyes and the rules of ordinary society. These islands became stages for incredible luxury, wild parties, and personal empires built on sun, sand, and staggering privilege. But behind the glamorous facades, something darker often lurked. The very isolation that made these islands so appealing also made them the perfect settings for secrets that could fester, grow, and sometimes spiral into scandal, mystery, and even tragedy. When you're the absolute ruler of your own little kingdom, who's there to witness what happens behind closed gates or what gets buried in the sand? For some of history's most famous heiresses and royals, their private island paradises became gilded cages, backdrops for shocking betrayals, unexplained disappearances, and whispers of curses that money simply couldn't silence. In this video, we're pulling back the palm fronds on these secluded worlds. We're going to explore the true stories of royalty and Gilded Age heiresses who bought their own slices of heaven, only to find that paradise often has a price. We'll uncover the glamour, yes, but also the ominous secrets woven into their sun-bleached shores. This is a journey into the heart of extreme wealth and isolation, where the line between a dream and a nightmare is as thin as the horizon over the ocean. So settle in, because the history of private islands is far stranger and far darker than you ever imagined. To understand the allure of these island escapes, we first need to step back into the glittering, transformative era that created the women who could afford them. The late 19th century in America was the Gilded Age, a period of explosive industrial growth. Fortunes were being made overnight by titans of railroads, steel, and oil. Men whose wealth so drastically outpaced old money elites that they were dubbed robber barons. Their daughters, heiresses to these unprecedented fortunes, were raised in unparalleled opulence. They were the original poor little rich girls, surrounded by marble mansions on Fifth Avenue in summer, cottages in Newport that were the size of European palaces. Yet, for all their money, these new money families lacked one crucial thing in the snobbish hierarchy of high society: social legitimacy. Across the Atlantic, the situation was almost perfectly reversed. Europe's ancient aristocratic families, with their storied titles and sprawling ancestral estates, were facing a modern problem: a severe lack of cash. Their lands and titles were impressive, but their coffers were often empty, unable to maintain the crumbling castles and lavish lifestyles their names demanded. This created a fascinating transatlantic marketplace. American industrial wealth began to seek European aristocratic validation through a series of highly publicized marriages. Heiresses like Consuelo Vanderbilt, who was essentially coerced into marrying the Duke of Marlborough, became currency. Their massive dowries, sometimes in the millions of dollars, were traded for a title: a duchess, a princess, a lady. This exchange rebuilt the roofs of English stately homes and restored French chateaus, all while granting the Vanderbilts and restores the social prestige they crave. But what happens after the wedding? For these new princesses and duchesses, life in a rigid, often cold European court could be stifling. They had more money than almost anyone on the planet, but they were still bound by strict social rules and the watchful eyes of tradition. This is where the private island entered the picture as the ultimate status symbol. It was a possession that went beyond a title. A title came with history, expectations, and often a critical public. An island was a blank slate. It was a declaration of total financial and creative independence. It whispered, "I have so much power that I do not need to play by anyone's rules, not even those of the society I bought into." For a Gilded Age heiress, an island was the one thing her fortune and new title could not automatically grant her: true privacy and absolute control. It was the final logical step in a life dedicated to acquiring not just things, but experiences in realms utterly separate from the common world. It was the ultimate retreat from prying eyes, and as we will see, that very seclusion could become a double-edged sword. And so it was with this intoxicating mix of wealth, title, and a thirst for absolute privacy that these women and their families set out to claim their personal paradises. Yet the dream of an island utopia was not a new one, and its potential for darkness had a long and storied history right on America's own doorstep. To truly understand the weight of these gilded secrets, we must first visit the original American private island, a place where legend and tragedy are baked into the very soil. Just off the coast of Long Island, New York, lies Gardiners Island. It is not a tropical paradise purchased with new industrial money, but something far older and more profound. This is the oldest English settlement in New York State and the largest privately owned island in America. Its story begins not with a tycoon, but with a king. In 1639, King Charles I of England granted the island to Lyon Gardiner, a Scottish engineer, as a royal patent for his service. This wasn't just a sale, it was the creation of a feudal lordship, a private kingdom that predated the United States itself by over a century. For generations, the Gardiner family ruled their domain, accumulating immense wealth and a status that was both aristocratic and uniquely American. But with this ancient privilege came an equally ancient shadow. The island's curse, as the stories go, seems to have been born from greed and betrayal. The most famous legend involves the pirate Captain William Kidd. In the late 1600s, it's said that Kidd, perhaps knowing the Gardiners, buried a vast treasure trove on the island, chests overflowing with gold, jewels, and Spanish pieces of 8. While some treasure was indeed recovered and used as evidence against Kidd, who was eventually hanged for piracy, whispers persisted that the bulk of it remained, hidden somewhere in the island's dense interior. This buried fortune, stained with blood and acquired through violence, is often cited as the source of the family's misfortune. It was as if the pirates' greed had seeped into the land, cursing all who tried to possess it fully. The 20th century seemed to make the curse a grim reality for the Gardiner lineage. The family tree became riddled with shocking tragedies and mysterious deaths that read like a Gothic novel. One heir, Robert David Lyon Gardiner, who fiercely guarded the island's privacy and its legacy, was a man consumed by the past, his own life was marked by a deep-seated belief in the family's curse, a belief tragically reinforced by events. His beloved niece, Alexandra Gardiner, was his chosen heir, the future queen of this private kingdom. Her life was cut short in a devastating car accident, a loss from which her uncle never recovered. Another family member, John Lyon Gardiner, died under strange and unresolved circumstances, with the official cause listed as a fall, though rumors of foul play and family disputes swirled for decades. The island itself seemed to breed conflict, with bitter legal battles over inheritance pitting family members against one another in costly and venomous court fights, tearing the dynasty apart from within. Beyond the feuds and the fatalities, the island gained a reputation for being actively haunted. Visitors and family members told stories of eerie sensations, of seeing the ghost of Captain Kidd still guarding his plunder, and of an oppressive atmosphere that would settle over certain parts of the island. For its aristocratic owners, Gardiners Island was the ultimate symbol of old money legitimacy, a direct link to a royal past, but it was also a gilded cage of secrets. The isolation that protected their privacy also served to contain their scandals, their grief, and the whispers of a curse that no amount of land or money could ever lift. It was a stark, early warning that an island paradise could be just as easily a prison of one's own making. A lesson the Gilded Age heiresses who followed would learn in their own ways. While Gardiners Island represented the old world aristocracy and its accompanying curses, a very different kind of private island was emerging, one that symbolized the new power of American industrial wealth. Far from the chilly waters of Long Island Sound, off the coast of Georgia, lay Jekyll Island. By the late 19th century, this became the winter playground for a group so unimaginably wealthy, they were known simply as the club. Its membership roster was a who's who of American capitalism, names that still echo with power today: J.P. Morgan, William Rockefeller, Joseph Pulitzer, William K. Vanderbilt, and Macy's department store founder, Marshall Field. To join this club, you had to be invited, and your net worth had to be at least $10 million at a time, when the average American worker earned perhaps $500 a year. They built a clubhouse so grand it was dubbed the largest log cabin in the world, complete with a formal dining room that could seat 150 guests and a staff of 500 to cater to their every whim. Here, amidst the Spanish moss and live oaks, the titans of industry could relax, hunt, and socialize far from the pressures and prying eyes of the public. But in November of 1910, the island's purpose shifted from leisure to something far more consequential. Under a cloak of almost comical secrecy, a small group of men arrived at the Jekyll Island Club. They traveled under false names, arriving on a private railway car owned by one of the members. To any observers, it might have looked like just another gathering of friends. In reality, this was a clandestine meeting of the nation's most powerful bankers, convened by Senator Nelson Aldrich. Their mission was nothing less than to completely redesign the American financial system. The panic of 1907 had exposed the dangerous fragility of the nation's banks, and these men believed they were the only ones with the expertise to fix it. The public, in their view, couldn't be trusted to understand the complexities, and Congress was seen as too gridlocked and populist to craft a sensible solution. So they took matters into their own hands, drafting the blueprint for what would eventually become the Federal Reserve System. For 9 days, they debated and designed in absolute secrecy. The plan they cooked up on Jekyll Island would centralize the nation's banking reserves, creating a lender of last resort to prevent future financial collapses. It was a monumental piece of policy, crafted by a handful of unelected, private individuals on a private island they completely controlled. When the Aldrich Plan was finally presented to Congress, its origins were deliberately obscured. The public had no idea it was born from a secret meeting of the very bankers it was meant to regulate. This lack of transparency fueled immediate and lasting conspiracy theories. Critics argued that the Federal Reserve was not a public institution created for the stability of the economy, but a banker's bank, designed to protect the interests of the ultra-wealthy and consolidate their control over the nation's money supply. The true story of the meeting only came to light years later, confirming the worst suspicions of many. Jekyll Island represents a different kind of dark secret, one not of personal tragedy or a family curse, but of systemic power wielded in the shadows. It showcased how the extreme privacy afforded by a private enclave could be used to make decisions that affected every single American, all without any public input or oversight. The island's isolation wasn't just for relaxation. It was a tool, a soundproof room where the rules of the modern world could be written by the few for the many. It proved that the greatest secrets aren't always buried treasure or ghost stories. Sometimes the most powerful secrets are the ones that shape the very fabric of our society, drafted in places where no one else is allowed to listen. Yet for all its power to conceal the dealings of titans, the privacy of an island could also serve as the perfect stage for a personal scandal to explode into public view. This brings us to a very different kind of island story, one not of corporate conspiracy, but of a marriage imploding with the force of a hurricane. The setting shifts from the corporate retreat of Jekyll Island to the sun-drenched waters of Florida, and the players are none other than one of America's most storied dynasties, the Vanderbilt. While the name Vanderbilt conjures images of grand Fifth Avenue mansions and Newport cottages, our story centers on a specific branch of the family and a specific, devastating divorce. William Kissam Vanderbilt II, known to his family as Willie K., was the grandson of the original railroad magnate. He was a man born into unimaginable wealth, a yachtsman, and a philanthropist. In 1908, he married his first wife, Virginia Graham Fair, the daughter of a U.S. senator and silver mining millionaire. Their wedding was a society event of the highest order, a union of two powerful American fortunes. They seemed to have it all: immense wealth, social standing, and 2 children. They built a life that appeared, from the outside, to be the very picture of Gilded Age bliss. But behind the elegant facade, the marriage was crumbling. The couple began spending increasing amounts of time apart, with Willie K., often on his lavish yacht or traveling the world. The cracks became a chasm when Virginia began hearing persistent, painful rumors. The whispers suggested her husband was not just having an affair. He had established an entire second life. The object of his affection was a woman named Rosamund Lancaster Warburton, a member of a prominent Pennsylvania family, and the rumors went further, alleging that this wasn't a fleeting romance, but a long-term relationship that had produced two secret children, a son and a daughter, born while Willie K. was still legally married to Virginia. This was the ultimate betrayal, a scandal that threatened to tarnish the pristine Vanderbilt name. In an era where society divorces were still somewhat taboo and handled with extreme discretion, the allegations of a secret second family were explosive. Virginia, humiliated and enraged, decided she would not go quietly. In 1927, she filed for divorce in a spectacularly public manner, and her demands were as immense as her hurt. She didn't just want a settlement, she wanted a statement. And at the very top of her list of demands was a piece of real estate that symbolized everything about their gilded life together, their shared dreams, and now their spectacular failure, their private island retreat, Fisher Island. Just off the coast of Miami, Fisher Island was more than just a home. It was a self-contained paradise. Willie K. had purchased it and poured a fortune into its development, building a magnificent Mediterranean revival mansion, lush gardens, and a private zoo. It was their shared project, their sanctuary. For Virginia, claiming it in the divorce was about more than its monetary value. It was about reclaiming power, about taking the very symbol of their life together as compensation for his deception. The island became the central, bitterly fought-over trophy in the legal battle. The subsequent court proceedings pulled back the curtain on the Vanderbilt's private life with brutal clarity. Virginia's lawyers presented evidence of Willie K.'s double life, and the secret children were acknowledged. The press had a field day, splashing every salacious detail across the front pages. The private misery of America's royalty became public entertainment. In the end, the divorce was finalized in 1928, and the settlement was one of the largest of its time. Virginia received a staggering $8 million in cash, multiple properties, and most symbolically, she won Fisher Island. She had taken his paradise as her prize. But the story doesn't end with a victorious Virginia living happily ever after on her island. The victory was Pyrrhic. The immense social shame and the very public airing of their dirty laundry took a heavy toll. Virginia, now one of the wealthiest women in America, found herself isolated, the subject of gossip and pity. She eventually sold the island, unable to bear living in the monument to her failed marriage. For his part, Willie K. married Rosamund just 2 months after the divorce was finalized, legitimizing the relationship and the children, but his reputation was forever stained. Fisher Island stands as a starkly different kind of private island story. It wasn't about ancient curses or clandestine meetings of bankers. This was a deeply personal tragedy, a story of how the ultimate symbol of privacy and escape could become the most public evidence of betrayal. The very seclusion that should have protected their marriage instead became the setting where its fractures could widen away from watching eyes, until the whole thing finally shattered, sending ripples of scandal across the entire world. The island was both the cause and the prize, a gilded stage for a very human drama of love, lies, and revenge. Our journey through the gilded cages of the ultra-wealthy now takes us away from the tropical sun and across the Atlantic, to a place where the secrets are not whispered on the ocean breeze, but are murmured through the leaves of ancient trees. While not an island in the geographic sense, the Dark Hedges estate in Northern Ireland possessed the one quality that connects all these stories: profound, almost absolute seclusion. For the aristocratic Stuart family, This grand estate was their own private kingdom, a world set apart from the common man, and like the islands we've explored, it became the silent witness to a dynasty's heartbreaking decline, a story of political gambles, financial ruin, and a ghostly romance that forever changed its legacy. The story begins not with tragedy, but with ambition. In the 18th century, the Stuart family was a powerful force, and James Stuart, the head of the family, sought to build a home worthy of his name and status. He commissioned the construction of the grand Georgian mansion known as Grace Hill House, and to create an approach that would instill awe in every visitor, he planted a breathtaking avenue of beech trees. These trees were carefully planted to intertwine their branches as they grew, forming a haunting, cathedral-like tunnel leading to his door. This was not just landscaping. It was a statement of power, control, and permanence. The dark hedges were designed to show that the Stuarts were not just landowners. They were the architects of their own realm, masters of all they surveyed. For a time, the estate was the epicenter of social life, hosting lavish parties and gatherings for the Anglo-Irish elite. It was a golden age, built on the bedrock of inherited wealth and social standing. But the foundation of that wealth was about to crumble. The Stuarts' downfall was inextricably linked to the tumultuous political landscape of Ireland and their own unwavering allegiance to the British crown. As tensions between the Irish population and the British authorities escalated, families like the Stuarts, who were seen as representatives of the ruling class, found themselves in an increasingly precarious position. Their political loyalties, once their greatest asset, became a massive liability. The family invested heavily in maintaining their status and their estate, but the economic pressures of the time, combined with the growing unrest, began to drain their fortune. They were spending vast sums to uphold a lifestyle that was becoming politically and socially untenable. The very isolation that had been their shield now became a trap, insulating them from the changing realities outside their gates until it was too late. The money simply ran out. The grand parties ceased. The upkeep on Grace Hill House became impossible, and the Stuart family was forced to abandon the home their ancestor had built with such pride. Their financial ruin was a slow, painful unraveling of a centuries-old dream, proving that no amount of land or seclusion could protect against the tides of history and poor fortune. Yet, the most enduring story to emerge from this fall from grace is not one of finance or politics, but of a heartbreaking romance that has forever marked the estate with a spectral presence. The story centers on Mary Stuart, often called the little princess of the family. As legend tells it, Mary was a radiant young woman who fell deeply in love with the stable hand employed on the estate, a man far beneath her aristocratic station. Their secret meetings under the intertwined branches of the beech trees became the stuff of local gossip and eventually family scandal. When her family discovered the affair, they were furious. Such a union was unthinkable, a threat to their social standing that was already on shaky ground. They forbade the relationship immediately. The stable hand was dismissed and sent away, his fate unknown. Mary, utterly heartbroken and trapped in her gilded cage at Grace Hill House, is said to have succumbed to her despair. Some versions of the tale say she grew ill and died of a broken heart. Others suggest a far darker end, that she took her own life, unable to bear the loss of her love in the oppressive weight of her family's expectations. It is her spirit, they say, that never left. The avenue of trees, once a symbol of her family's power, became the stage for her eternal mourning. Visitors and locals have long reported seeing the ghostly gray figure of a young woman drifting silently between the gnarled trunks of the beeches, often on the anniversary of her death. She is not a malevolent spirit, but a sorrowful one, a permanent resident forever searching the lane for her lost love. The haunting beauty of the dark hedges is now inextricably tied to this tragic tale. The eerie atmosphere is no longer just a product of the twisting branches. It is charged with the emotion of Mary's story. Her ghost gives the estate its soul, transforming it from a mere failed aristocratic showpiece into a monument of lost love and the human cost of rigid social hierarchies. The Stuart family's quest for isolation created the perfect conditions for this tragedy to unfold away from prying eyes. And in the end, it also created the perfect, secluded stage for their greatest shame to become its most famous legend, ensuring that long after the family's money and power vanished, their story would never be forgotten. But while the American heiresses and British aristocrats were buying islands for parties and privacy, a very different kind of exiled royalty was seeking his own form of escape in one of the most remote corners of the world. Our story now travels thousands of miles from the manicured estates of the Anglo-Irish elite to the raw, untamed wilderness of the Alaskan coast. Here, in the frigid waters of the Kodiak archipelago, a disgraced Russian Grand Duke attempted to leave his past behind by purchasing his own remote fortress of solitude, a place called Spruce Island. The man at the center of this story is Grand Duke Alexei Alexandrovich, the fourth son of Tsar Alexander II of Russia. Born into the pinnacle of power and privilege, Alexei was groomed for a life of military service and ultimately placed in command of the Imperial Russian Navy. For a time, he cut a dashing figure in the courts of Europe, a tall, bearded Romanov known for his lavish spending, his love of fine food and wine, and his notorious appetite for romantic affairs. He was the embodiment of a Gilded Age, but his was a gilding applied to the decaying structure of the Russian Empire itself. The turning point in his life, and the event that would send him searching for a remote hideaway, was the disastrous Russo-Japanese War. In 1904, the Russian Baltic Fleet, under Alexei's ultimate command as head of the Navy, embarked on an incredible 7-month voyage to confront the Japanese in the Pacific. The journey was a fiasco, marked by international incidents and low morale. The fleet's arrival at the Battle of Tsushima in 1905 was its final act. In a single day, the Japanese Navy annihilated the Russian fleet, sinking or capturing nearly all of its ships. It was one of the most decisive naval defeats in history, and it humiliated Russia on the world stage. The public and the military needed a scapegoat, and all fingers pointed directly at Grand Duke Alexei, the man who had enjoyed a life of pleasure and privilege while his navy languished was blamed for its catastrophic unpreparedness. Under intense pressure, he was forced to resign his post in disgrace. The glittering world of the St. Petersburg court, once his playground, became a place of scorn and whispers. He was a royal prince without a purpose, tainted by a national humiliation. It was in this context of shame and exile that Alexei turned his gaze to the remote frontier of Alaska. Though the United States had purchased Alaska from Russia in 1867, the region still held a powerful connection to the Russian aristocracy. For Alexei, it represented a place beyond the reach of the European press and the judgmental eyes of the Tsarist court. He found what he was looking for on Spruce Island, a rugged, forested outpost near Kodiak Island. He purchased it, building a substantial, well-equipped hunting lodge as his base of operations. This was not the tropical paradise of a Vanderbilt. This was a harsh, masculine retreat suited to a man trying to outrun his failures. On Spruce Island, the Grand Duke attempted to reconstruct the life of pleasure he could no longer enjoy in Russia. He hosted extravagant hunting parties, importing fine linens, crystal, and vast quantities of champagne and caviar to his rustic lodge. He surrounded himself with a small entourage of loyal retainers, and most scandalously, with his mistresses. The isolation of the island was the entire point. It allowed him to continue his hedonistic lifestyle far from any scrutiny. Here, he was not the disgraced admiral who lost a fleet. He was simply the host, the wealthy sportsman, the master of his small, frozen domain. He could pretend for a time that the outside world and its judgments did not exist. Yet, this self-imposed exile could not last forever. The Grand Duke's health, likely eroded by decades of excess, began to fail him. He left Spruce Island for the last time and traveled to Paris, where he died in 1908, a shadow of the man he had once been. His Alaskan retreat stands as a profoundly different kind of private island story. It wasn't about building a legacy or hosting society events. For Grand Duke Alexei, Spruce Island was a bunker, a place to hide from the consequences of his own life. Its value was not in its beauty or its resources, but in its immense distance from the world he had failed. It was the ultimate escape for a man whose gilded cage had been shattered by reality, leaving him with nowhere to go but as far away as he possibly could. From the frozen isolation of a Russian Grand Duke's retreat, we now journey to the humid, moss-draped sea islands of the American South, to a place where the secrets were not of personal failure or scandalous affairs, but of an entire community's erased history. Just off the coast of South Carolina lies Daufuskie Island, a place that feels lost in time, accessible only by boat, and haunted by the whispers of the past. For much of the 20th century, this tranquil island became the private playground for one of America's wealthiest and most powerful families, the Mellons. But the peace they purchased was built upon a foundation of racial injustice and the quiet displacement of the island's native inhabitants, the Gullah people, whose story is one of the most poignant and overlooked tragedies of the Gilded Age's legacy. To understand the weight of the Mellon family's presence, we must first understand who they were and the world they came from. The name is a stand-in for a dynasty of immense industrial power, a family whose fortune was so vast and influence so pervasive that their arrival on any scene signaled a complete transformation. Think of a name like Carnegie, Mellon, or Rockefeller, that tier of wealth that could literally reshape landscapes to its will. This particular family made their fortune in banking and industry, amassing a level of capital that granted them not just luxury, but near sovereign power. They were accustomed to acquiring whatever they desired, and what they desired was a private sanctuary, a place untouched by the modern world where they could retreat entirely on their own terms. Daufuskie, with its pristine beaches, dense maritime forests, and palpable sense of isolation, seemed like the perfect blank slate. But Dalfuskie was not a blank slate. For generations, it had been home to the Gullah people, descendants of enslaved West Africans who worked the island's cotton and indigo plantations before the Civil War. Their isolation on these sea islands had allowed them to preserve a distinct Creole language and a rich culture that retained more of its African roots than almost any other in America. They were a resilient, close-knit community of farmers, fishermen, and craftspeople who had lived on and worked the land for over a century. They owned their homes, their churches, and their small farms. To them, Dalfuskie wasn't a retreat. It was their ancestral home, the very heart of their identity and survival. When the Mellon family began acquiring large tracts of the island in the early 20th century, it was not a simple real estate transaction. It was the beginning of a slow, systematic takeover. They wanted the entire island for their private estate, and they used their immense financial and legal power to make it happen. Through a series of purchases, and according to many accounts, coercive tactics, they began to acquire Gullah-owned property. For families living a subsistence lifestyle, the offer of cash from a powerful white northern industrialist was often an offer they couldn't refuse, but it was rarely a fair negotiation. The power dynamic was utterly skewed. Other families found themselves entangled in complex legal battles over property titles, a common tactic used to dispossess African American landowners throughout the South, where historical records could be obscure or deliberately challenged. One by one, Gullah families were pushed off the land their ancestors had toiled on for generations. The family then erected a literal wall around their new domain. They built a high fence that cut across the island, demarcating their private paradise from the world they had taken it from. Armed security guards patrolled the perimeter, ensuring that the previous residents could not return to the homes, cemeteries, and fishing grounds that were rightfully theirs. The message was chillingly clear. This island now belonged to someone else. The Mellon family's compound became a world of immense privilege, with a grand main house, guest cottages, and manicured grounds, all existing just yards away from the poignant evidence of the community they had displaced. The racial tension was not a dramatic event, but a quiet, ever-present reality, buried just beneath the surface of the manicured lawns and peaceful beaches. The island's tranquility was a façade, a privilege enjoyed by a few that was purchased with the erased heritage and broken connections of many. The most heartbreaking symbol of this erasure is the story of the island's cemeteries. Scattered throughout Dalfuskie are small, often hidden, Gullah burial grounds, where generations of island residents were laid to rest. These sacred sites, often marked by simple seashells or broken pottery instead of stone, were enclosed within the Mellon family's private fence. Former residents who held deep spiritual and cultural traditions honoring their ancestors were now forbidden from visiting their own family grave sites. They could no longer clean the plots, leave offerings, or pay their respects. The ultimate indignity was the family's construction of a skeet shooting range directly over one of these burial grounds. The sound of gunshots and shattered clay pigeons replaced the quiet prayers and hymns that once honored the dead, a profound and deeply disrespectful act that showed a complete disregard for the people and the history that had been there long before they arrived. For decades, this was the hidden truth of Dalfuskie Island. The public narrative was one of a wealthy family's beautiful private escape, The dark secret was the systematic displacement and cultural erasure that made it possible. It stands as a starkly different kind of gilded cage story. There were no secret children or ghostly lovers here. The secret was an entire community's right to their homeland, quietly extinguished by the sheer force of wealth and privilege. The island's isolation, which had once protected the unique Gullah culture, was ultimately used against them, allowing this injustice to unfold away from the eyes of the world, a quiet tragedy buried in the South Carolina sand. While the Mellon family story on Dafusky reveals a hidden history of displacement, another Gilded Age dynasty constructed their island paradise on a fortune with a far more global and morally fraught origin. We now travel north to the cool, fresh waters of the Great Lakes, to a place that feels like a perfectly preserved Victorian postcard, Mackinac Island, Michigan. With its ban on automobiles, its horse-drawn carriages, and its grand, sprawling hotel, the island is a living monument to a bygone era of elegance. And for decades, the name most famously associated with this idyllic retreat was Astor. But the immense fortune that allowed the Astors to build and vacation on Mackinac was not just built on real estate and fur, as the family legacy often suggests. A significant portion of it was ruthlessly extracted from the misery and addiction of countless people on the other side of the world through the brutal and highly profitable opium trade. To understand how an American family became entangled in this enterprise, we need to look at the architect of the fortune, John Jacob Astor I. He arrived in America as a poor German immigrant in 1784, and with staggering ambition, built the first true multimillion-dollar fortune in the United States. While his later investments in New York City real estate are well documented, forming the bedrock of the family's lasting wealth, his early and critical period of wealth accumulation is often glossed over. His initial empire was built on furs through his American Fur Company, which held a monopoly on the trade and operated with a notorious, often violent, competitive zeal. But the fur trade itself had a complicated financial mechanism. Astor would send ships loaded with furs from Oregon and the Great Lakes to the bustling port of Canton, China. There, the furs were sold for a tremendous profit. But there was a problem. The Chinese government, under the Qing dynasty, had little interest in most Western goods. They demanded payment in silver, creating a massive trade deficit for American and European merchants. The solution for men like Astor was both simple and monstrously unethical: opium. Grown in British-controlled India, opium was a commodity the Chinese market craved. Despite its imperial ban, Astor, along with other powerful traders, saw an opportunity to balance the books and generate unimaginable profits. He began using the proceeds from his fur sales to purchase opium, which his ships would then smuggle into China, often with the help of corrupt officials and violent smugglers. This illicit cargo was then traded for the Chinese tea, silks, and porcelain that were in high demand back in America and Europe, completing a highly profitable triangular trade. Astor was not the largest American opium trader. That title likely belongs to the Perkins family of Boston, but he was a significant and willing participant. His meticulously kept account books, now housed in historical archives, contain clear, coldly clinical entries detailing his investments in opium cargoes, treating the addictive drug with the same dispassionate ledger entries as any other trade good. The profits from this multi-faceted empire were astronomical, and they funded the Astor family's ascent into the absolute pinnacle of American society. It was this money that built the original Astor mansions on Fifth Avenue, defined the social season with Mrs. Astor's infamous 400 list of eligible elites, and cemented their name as synonymous with old money respectability. And it was this same money that flowed into the development of Mackinac Island. The Astors were among the early investors in the island's transformation into a summer resort for the Midwestern elite. The iconic Grand Hotel, with its world's longest porch, represented the refined, public-facing outcome of the Astor wealth, a place of clean air, genteel society, and impeccable manners, a world away from the violent coercion of the fur trade and the squalor of the opium dens their fortune helped supply. This deliberate separation between the source of the wealth and its public enjoyment is the ultimate act of Gilded Age whitewashing. The Astor family, and others like them, engaged in a process that historians call conspicuous virtue. As their wealth became more established, they began pouring millions into philanthropic causes, public libraries, museums like the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and charitable foundations. These grand, benevolent gestures helped launder their reputations, transforming their image from that of ruthless profiteers into beloved civic benefactors. The opium trade, a practice that severely weakened Chinese society and contributed to the devastating opium wars, was quietly erased from the family narrative, buried under layers of marble philanthropy and high society glamour. The serene, orderly beauty of Mackinac Island thus stands as a monument to this very contradiction. It is a place that represents the peak of Gilded Age leisure, a paradise purchased with a fortune that contained a deeply hidden poison. The island's tranquil atmosphere and old-world charm serve as the perfect distraction from the uncomfortable truth that the Astor legacy, and by extension, this beloved American landmark, is partially built on a foundation of human suffering and addiction, a dark secret as potent and lingering as the drug itself. Yet for all its carefully constructed serenity and intellectual glamour, the island itself seemed to absorb and amplify the dark energies of its famous guests. The physical layout of the main house, with its cramped, shared bedrooms and thin walls, meant that private arguments became public knowledge almost instantly. A cutting remark made at the breakfast table would be dissected and analyzed by everyone by lunch. The isolation that was meant to foster creative freedom instead created a pressure cooker of egos, where every slight was magnified and every witty riposte carried the weight of a declaration of war. The very beauty of the surroundings, the shimmering water, the dense pine forests stood in stark contrast to the bitter human dramas unfolding within. It was a gilded cage for some of the sharpest minds of a generation, a place where they were trapped not by walls, but by their own reputations and the exhausting need to constantly perform. This toxic environment inevitably led to ruptures, and none was more devastating than the feud between Alexander Woollcott and Harpo Marx. The two had been the closest of friends for years, with Woollcott even serving as the inspiration for the unspoken, harp-playing Marx brother. Their bond was a central pillar of the Neshobe community, But Wolcott's capacity for cruelty knew no bounds, even for those he loved most. During a particularly vicious argument, Wolcott unleashed a torrent of personal insults, so deeply wounding that Harpo, a man known for his boundless joy and silence, was left shattered. He simply walked away, boarded a boat, and left the island in the Friendship behind for good. He never returned to Neshobe. This was more than a simple falling out. It was a symbolic death at the heart of the Round Table. If the warmth between Wolcott and Harpo could not survive the island's atmosphere, then what hope was there for anyone else? The final, haunting chapter of Neshobe Island's story belongs to its king, Alexander Wolcott himself. In January of 1943, he was back on the island, though the heyday of the Round Table was long past. The group had scattered, their witty magazine, The New Yorker, now a stable institution. Their lives moved on to different cities and different circles. Wolcott was participating in a radio quiz show broadcast from New York City, a program called The People's Platform. During a discussion on the topic of Nazi war crimes, Wolcott, never one for measured tones, launched into a characteristically fiery and impassioned condemnation. Suddenly, in the middle of his sentence, he suffered a massive heart attack. He slumped over the microphone, dead at the age of 56. The man who had made his living and his legend with his voice was silenced forever on a national broadcast. His body was returned to Vermont, to the island he had ruled with such a contradictory mix of generosity and tyranny. His ashes were interred there, making him a permanent resident of the one place that truly embodied his complex legacy, a place of brilliant light and profound darkness, of uproarious laughter and the deepest, most personal pain. Neshobe Island stands not as a monument to wit, but as a cautionary tale about the price of a brilliant mind when it is turned inward, proving that even the most beautiful paradise can become a prison of one's own making. And so our exploration of private islands and their secrets brings us to a very different kind of American fortune, one not built on ancient inheritances or industrial monopolies, but on the power of persuasion itself. From the intellectual bitterness of Neshobe Island, we travel south to the sun-bleached, mangrove-lined shores of Uzapa Island, just off the coast of Florida in the Pine Island Sound. Today, it is known as a quiet, exclusive resort, a place of pink buildings and lush greenery. But in the Roaring '20s, it was the fiercely guarded private domain of Baron Collier, a man who arguably invented modern advertising and who, according to persistent local legend, used his island not just for relaxation, but as a covert command center for a bootlegging empire that supercharged his wealth and political power. To understand the scale of this alleged operation, you first have to understand the man. Baron Collier was a force of nature. He arrived in New York City from Memphis with little more than ambition and an innate understanding of human psychology. He pioneered the concept of national advertising, securing exclusive contracts to place posters and billboards on streetcars and in subways across American cities. His company, the Baron Collier Advertising Company, became the largest of its kind in the world, making him a multimillionaire by his late 30s. But Collier wanted more than money. He sought influence and a legacy. He set his sights on Florida, then a frontier of swampland and potential. He began buying up vast tracts of land, eventually accumulating over 1.2 million acres, a staggering area larger than the state of Delaware. His holdings were so extensive that a new county, Collier County, was created and named in his honor. He became the state's largest landowner and taxpayer, a political kingmaker whose support could make or break a campaign. This is where the timeline gets interesting and where the rumors find their fertile ground. Collier's massive spending spree in Florida coincided almost perfectly with one of the most transformative pieces of legislation in American history, the 18th Amendment and the Volstead Act, which ushered in the era of Prohibition in 1920. Overnight, the production and sale of alcoholic beverages became illegal, creating a vacuum that was instantly filled by organized crime and opportunistic entrepreneurs. The geography of Southwest Florida was a bootlegger's dream. Its countless islands, hidden inlets, and remote waterways provided perfect cover for the rum runners who transported liquor from the Bahamas and Cuba to a thirsty American public. The operation required safe harbors, places where valuable cargo could be transferred from larger ocean-going vessels to smaller, faster boats that could slip past the Coast Guard. It required secrecy, security, and a complete lack of prying eyes. And this is where Baron Collier's Usurpa Island enters the story. The legend, passed down through generations of fishermen and old-time Floridians, is that Collier's Island was not just his home, it was the perfect privatized transshipment point. The theory goes that his immense wealth provided the capital to finance large-scale smuggling operations. His political influence allegedly offered a layer of protection, ensuring that law enforcement would turn a blind eye to the comings and goings around his private kingdom. Most crucially, his ownership of Usurpa Island provided the ideal logistical base. Deep water channels accessible only to those who knew the way could accommodate the motherships from the Caribbean. From there, the cases of whiskey and rum could be quickly unloaded and hidden in the island's dense vegetation or in concealed warehouses before being distributed under the cover of darkness to points all along the Gulf Coast. The very isolation that made it a peaceful retreat for a millionaire also made it an impeccable haven for contraband, while definitive smoking gun evidence remains elusive. Collier was far too shrewd to keep detailed ledgers of illicit activities. The circumstantial case is powerfully compelling. His sudden, explosive expansion of his Florida land holdings required a constant, massive influx of cash, far beyond what even a successful advertising baron might readily have on hand. The profits from bootlegging would explain it. Furthermore, his rapid ascent to become the most powerful unelected figure in Florida politics suggests a source of influence that went beyond simple land ownership. Money talks, but money generated from an illegal, high-risk enterprise buys a different kind of silence and loyalty. The legend persists because it fits the man, the place, and the time so perfectly. Usurpa Island represents a uniquely American kind of dark secret. It wasn't about a family curse or a tragic romance. It was about ambition, capitalism, and the audacious blurring of the lines between business, politics, and crime. For Baron Collier, the island may have been the ultimate tool, a private fortress that helped him build a public empire, all while hiding the rum-soaked truth of its foundation in the warm, shallow waters of the Florida coast. Far to the north, off the rugged coast of Scotland, lies a place where the very stones seem to whisper of betrayal and the winds carry an ancient grievance. Rough Island, a stark and lonely outcrop in the Firth of Forth, holds a darkness that makes the personal scandals of heiresses and the financial machinations of tycoons feel almost modern. Its story is woven into the very fabric of Scottish history, a curse born not from piracy or greed, but from a king's broken promise and a clan's shattered faith. This is the story of the Stuart monarchs and the enduring shadow their downfall cast upon a solitary piece of land. The legend begins in the tumultuous 17th century, a time of deep religious and political division across Britain. The island was historically a possession of the powerful Clan Forrester, loyal supporters of the Stuart kings. When civil war erupted between the royalist cavaliers, who backed King Charles I, and the parliamentarian Roundheads led by Oliver Cromwell, the Forresters stood firmly by their monarch. They offered Rough Island as a strategic refuge and a safe haven for the king's supporters, a testament to their unwavering fealty. As the war turned against the royalists, the island's importance grew. It is said that Charles himself, or perhaps his son, the future Charles II, took shelter there, relying on the clan's protection for his very survival. In gratitude for this loyalty and shelter in his darkest hour, the king made a solemn vow to the Forrester chief that the island would remain in their family's possession in perpetuity, a royal grant for service rendered that could never be broken. This royal promise became the bedrock of the clan's identity and their most cherished possession. But the wheel of fortune is merciless. Charles I was defeated, captured, and ultimately executed. His son, Charles II, was forced into exile, and the Commonwealth under Cromwell's rule seized royalist lands across the country. In a devastating act of betrayal, either out of political necessity or sheer desperation for funds, the exiled king, or his representatives, reneged on his sacred vow. The ownership of Rough Island was signed away, sold to another noble family to fill the empty coffers of the crown in exile. The Forresters were dispossessed of the land that had been promised to them forever, their loyalty repaid not with honor, but with a deed of sale. It was in this moment of profound betrayal that the curse was said to have been laid. As the Forrester chief and his clansmen were forced from their ancestral holding, a solemn oath was uttered, not against the king himself, but against the island. It was declared that the land would never know peace or prosperity again, that any soul who claimed it without the Forresters' blood in their veins would be plagued by misfortune, their line haunted by tragedy until the land was returned to its rightful owners. The island itself was stained by the king's broken word, and it would forever punish those who tried to tame it. For centuries that followed, the curse appeared to hold a grim power. The island passed through the hands of a series of aristocratic owners, each seemingly touched by a strange run of bad luck. Financial ruin, sudden illness, and tragic accidents seemed to dog those who held the title. The most common and persistent stories tell of a series of fires, inexplicable blazes that would break out in the main house, destroying property and, on at least one occasion, claiming a life. These were not ordinary accidents. Locals whispered of cold spots in rooms just before the flames ignited, of the sound of angry voices on the wind when the sun went down. The island gained such a foreboding reputation that it spent long periods completely abandoned, considered too unlucky and too dangerous to inhabit. This reputation for being accursed inevitably reached the ears of the Gilded Age elite, for whom a Scottish title and a Highland estate were the ultimate trophies. It is rumored that a wealthy American heiress, perhaps a Vanderbilt or a Whitney, briefly considered purchasing Rough Island in the late 19th century, captivated by the romantic notion of owning a piece of royal Stuart history. Her advisors, after making discreet inquiries, reportedly urged her against it in the strongest terms. They relayed the tales of the curse, the fires, and the financial disasters that had befallen every previous owner. The potential for scandal was too great, and the risk to her social standing too pronounced. In the end, the dark legend of Rough Island protected it from becoming just another gilded commodity, a strange paradox where a curse acted as a preservative, keeping the modern world in its thirst for acquisition at bay. Today, Rough Island stands as a quiet monument to a promise broken centuries ago. The curse, whether a genuine supernatural force or simply the power of a powerful story to shape perception, has become an inseparable part of its identity. It serves as a poignant reminder that for all their power and grandeur, the actions of kings and queens could ripple through time, etching stories of betrayal and loss not just into history books, but into the very landscape itself, creating a different kind of gilded cage, one built not with walls, but with words of a promise that was never kept. While the historical islands we've explored held their secrets in sprawling mansions and crumbling ruins, the modern era has perfected the art of concealment behind walls of pure capital and cutting-edge technology. Just off the coast of Miami Beach lies Indian Creek Island, a man-made sliver of land that has earned the nickname Billionaire Bunker. This is not a retreat for old money aristocrats or a playground for heiresses. It is a fully realized fortress of 21st century wealth, where privacy is not just a luxury, but an impenetrable commodity. The island is a mere 300 acres, a looping ribbon of road surrounding a serene golf course and a collection of just 40 lavish estates. But the simplicity ends with the geography. To even approach Indian Creek by water is to be met with a formidable show of force. The island is encircled by its own private police force, equipped with state-of-the-art speedboats and a militaristic zeal for enforcing a 200-yard no-approach zone. Helicopters with powerful cameras are routinely turned away, and paparazzi drones are reportedly shot out of the sky. This is not a community with a neighborhood watch. It is a sovereign entity protected by a small army funded by the astronomical tax contributions of its residents. The roster of homeowners reads like a who's who of contemporary power. From supermodel Adriana Lima and investor Carl Icahn to billionaire tech mogul and former New York City Mayor Michael Bloomberg, the island is a haven for those for whom public recognition is a daily hazard. The fundamental promise of Indian Creek is total erasure from the public record. The island's vigilante security force exists primarily to ensure that no one ever sees anything they are not meant to see. There are no public records of building permits readily available, no casual tours, and certainly no uninvited guests. This creates an environment where the most powerful people in the world can live with a level of anonymity that is utterly impossible anywhere else. They can sunbathe, host parties, and walk their dogs without a single photograph ever leaking out. Their most mundane moments guarded as fiercely as state secrets. But what is the true cost of such absolute seclusion? The dark secret of Indian Creek is not one specific event, but the very system itself. This level of security does not just keep the public out. It actively enables and conceals behavior that would otherwise be exposed to the light of public scrutiny. The walls and water barriers become a shield for all manner of transgressions. Whispers of colossal, behind-the-scenes corporate deals, struck on the golf course or in a poolside cabana, bypassing antitrust laws and shareholder oversight, are the stuff of local legend. The potential for market manipulation from within this sealed environment is immense, with no journalists or regulators within miles to overhear a careless word. The isolation also provides the perfect cover for high-stakes personal indiscretions. It is the ideal setting for extramarital affairs between the ultra-powerful, protected from the paparazzi who swarm the mainland mansions of Los Angeles and New York. Allegations of domestic disputes that would normally trigger a media firestorm are silenced before they can even begin, handled internally by a private security team with a vested interest in keeping the island's reputation, and by extension, its property values untarnished. The most profound scandal of Indian Creek is the one we can never know. It is the sum total of all the secrets its walls successfully contain, the unrecorded agreements, the hidden relationships, the unseen injustices. It represents the ultimate evolution of the private island dream, transforming from a place of leisure into a sanitized, hyper-secure vault where the world's most influential figures are granted the unparalleled privilege of living without a witness. While the tragic deaths and bitter legal battles were the very real, tangible evidence of the Gardiner family's so-called curse, the island's true power to repel outsiders came from something far more spectral. The family, understanding that a simple no trespassing sign was hardly a deterrent for treasure hunters and curiosity seekers, actively cultivated and amplified the island's eerie reputation. The most potent of these legends was the tale of the Phantom Ship, a ghostly apparition said to materialize in the misty waters of Gardiners Bay. Locals and intrepid sailors told of a shimmering, silent galleon, its sails full of a wind no one else could feel, gliding past the island's shore before vanishing into nothingness. This was no random ghost story. It was widely believed to be the spectral vessel of Captain William Kidd himself, eternally returning to guard his plunder, or perhaps to torment the family that had become the unintended guardians of his blood-stained fortune. The sighting of this ship was considered a dire omen, a warning to any who approached with greedy intentions that they were venturing into a realm where the normal rules of the world did not apply. This supernatural deterrent was powerfully complemented by the very real, feverish, and utterly futile searches for Kidd's lost treasure. For over 3 centuries, the promise of gold has acted like a siren's call, drawing fortune hunters to the island shores. The Gardiner family archives are filled with letters and petitions from would-be explorers begging for permission to dig, each armed with a new map or a fresh theory about where the pirate might have buried his chests. Some were convinced the treasure lay beneath a specific, oddly shaped tree. Others believed it was hidden in a cave that was only accessible at low tide. The family, particularly the fiercely protective Robert David Lyon Gardiner, understood that these seekers were a greater threat than any ghost. To manage this threat, they would occasionally grant permission for a search, but always under strict supervision, and with the condition that the family would receive a significant portion of any fine. This was a brilliant strategy. It gave the illusion of cooperation while ensuring any digging was controlled and ultimately pointless. The repeated, very public failures of these sanctioned expeditions only added another layer to the myth. If professional teams with the family's blessing couldn't find it, then the treasure must be protected by something more than just dirt and rock. It must be cursed. The genius of this strategy was how these two elements, the ghost story and the treasure hunt, worked in tandem to protect the family's actual secrets. The phantom ship and the whispers of a curse served as a supernatural security system, scaring off the superstitious. Meanwhile, the controlled, fruitless treasure hunts functioned as a pressure valve, satisfying the curiosity of the determined while simultaneously proving that nothing was there to find. This theatrical smokescreen of myth and mystery effectively hid the Gardiners' genuine, worldly concerns, the precise locations of their own legitimate valuables, the private burial sites of family members, and the day-to-day operations of their vast, profitable estate. The real treasure of Gardiners Island was not a pirate's chest of gold, but the privacy and sovereignty the family had maintained for centuries. By keeping everyone focused on a phantom and a fairy tale, they successfully diverted attention from their tangible assets and the profound, very human dramas of jealousy, grief, and rivalry that were the true curses playing out behind the scenes. The legends were not just stories. They were a calculated defense mechanism, a form of psychological armor that helped a fiercely private family guard their world from the prying eyes of the outside world for generations. Yet the secret discussions on Jekyll Island were not confined to the dry ledgers of banking and finance. Within that same rarefied atmosphere of total seclusion, another, far more sinister intellectual current was flowing among the members, one rooted not in economics, but in a twisted vision of human perfection. The same men who believed they alone were qualified to redesign the nation's monetary system also held deep convictions about who was qualified to exist within that society. The ideology of eugenics and its close cousin social Darwinism found fertile ground within the club's exclusive membership, revealing a dark philosophical underbelly to their immense power and privilege. To understand how these ideas took hold, we must look at the world through their eyes. These were men who had reached the absolute pinnacle of wealth and influence through relentless competition. They saw their success not as a product of fortune or circumstance, but as undeniable proof of their innate superiority. Social Darwinism, a misapplication of Charles Darwin's theories of natural selection to human societies, provided them with a perfect, pseudo-scientific justification for this belief. It posited that the wealthy and powerful were the fittest, the natural winners in the struggle for existence, while the poor, the disabled, and those from marginalized communities were inherently unfit. In their view, their vast fortunes were not just rewards, but evidence of their biological destiny. This mindset transformed compassion into a weakness and charity into a dangerous interference with the natural order. Why should they help those who nature itself had deemed unfit to thrive? This belief system hardened into a more active and terrifyingly organized movement, eugenics. The term, coined by Francis Galton, Darwin's cousin, means well-born. Its goal was to improve the genetic quality of the human population by encouraging the fit to reproduce. a concept called positive eugenics, and more chillingly, by preventing the unfit from having children at all. This was negative eugenics, and it was here that the intellectual discussions on Jekyll Island could translate into real-world horror. Members of the club and the wider circle of industrialists and intellectuals they moved in were not just passive believers. They were active funders and promoters of the eugenics cause. They provided significant financial backing for eugenics research at prestigious universities, funded the publication of journals and books promoting these ideas, and lobbied for legislation that would put their beliefs into law. The most tangible and devastating outcome of this lobbying was the push for compulsory sterilization laws. The men who gathered on Jekyll Island moved in the same social and financial circles as those who championed these policies. Their influence helped create a political climate where, by the 1920s, over 30 American states had passed laws allowing for the forced sterilization of individuals deemed feeble-minded, epileptic, or otherwise unfit. These laws targeted the poor, inmates of mental institutions, and people of color, resulting in the sterilization of tens of thousands of Americans against their will. The Supreme Court even upheld the constitutionality of these laws in the 1927 case Buck v. Bell, with Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes infamously declaring, "3 generations of imbeciles are enough." This American precedent did not go unnoticed abroad. It directly inspired and provided a model for the Nazi regime's own racial hygiene laws in the 1930s. The discussions that likely occurred on Jekyll Island then were not merely academic. They were part of a broader conversation among the elite about engineering society, not just through central banking, but through controlled human breeding. Their quest for a more orderly and efficient nation extended from the economy into the very gene pool. This reveals the profound dark side of their isolation. Secluded on their private island, surrounded only by others who shared their wealth and worldview, their beliefs were never challenged by the humanity of those they sought to eliminate. They could discuss the theoretical unfit without ever having to look a struggling family in the eye, or consider the individual dreams of a young woman in a state institution. Their power and their privacy insulated them from the brutal human consequences of their ideas, allowing them to treat people as problems to be solved rather than as human beings to be cared for. The same isolation that let them design the Federal Reserve in secret also let them nurture a philosophy of breathtaking cruelty, one that viewed vast segments of the American populace as genetic mistakes to be cleansed from the national body. The glittering facade of the Vanderbilt marriage finally shattered, not with a quiet whimper, but with a legal explosion that tore the family's secrets wide open. Virginia Fair Vanderbilt's divorce suit was the spark, but the confirmation of Willie K.'s secret life was the powder keg. The whispers that had haunted their marriage were no longer just rumors. They were presented in a cold, legal context, and at the heart of it all was the undeniable existence of an illegitimate daughter. Her name was Emily, and her very being was a testament to a long-running double life that society had only suspected. While the public scandal focused on the salacious details of the affair and the immense financial settlement, the private human tragedy was far more profound. For Emily and her brother William III, life was lived in a strange limbo. They were Vanderbilts in blood and name. Willie K. had acknowledged his paternity, but they were utterly excluded from the legitimate family's world. They grew up in the shadow of their father's immense fame and fortune, yet were forced to remain a closely guarded secret, their existence a threat to the Vanderbilt name that had to be contained. The meticulous concealment was a calculated effort to protect the family's standing in Newport, in New York, a standing that was already precarious after the very public and humiliating divorce. Willie K.'s marriage to their mother, Rosamund, just 2 months after the divorce was finalized, was a move toward legitimacy for the children, but it could never erase the stain of their origins in the eyes of the old money elite. They were the living, breathing evidence of a scandal that high society preferred to gossip about behind closed doors, not acknowledge at the dinner table. This created a bitter and lasting schism within the Vanderbilt dynasty itself. The official branch of the family, the children from his first marriage, were pitted against their half-siblings in a silent, cold war of inheritance and acknowledgement. The legitimate heirs, particularly his son William III, were seen as the true carriers of the Vanderbilt legacy, while Emily and her brother were often treated as a footnote, an embarrassment to be managed with financial trust funds and kept at a discreet distance. The fight for recognition wasn't just a matter of social acceptance. It was a protracted legal and emotional battle over the vast Vanderbilt fortune. Wills were contested, trusts were scrutinized, and the family lawyers became the arbiters of a familial civil war, all playing out in private to avoid further public spectacle. The immense wealth that was meant to secure the family's future instead became the weapon they used against each other, a testament to how a single secret, once exposed, can fracture a dynasty from the inside out. The paradise of Fisher Island, the symbol of their gilded life, stood as a monument to this division, won by the scorned wife, but ultimately too painful for anyone to enjoy. A perfect metaphor for a family whose dream of perfection had been irreparably broken by the very human frailties they tried so hard to conceal. This catastrophic failure did not occur in a vacuum, but was the direct result of a command structure riddled with the very privilege and incompetence that Alexei embodied. As head of the Navy, the Grand Duke was more of a courtly administrator than a seasoned admiral. He had been appointed to the post due to his royal birth, not his naval acumen. Under his leadership, the Imperial Russian Navy became a reflection of the decaying empire it served, top-heavy with aristocrats, resistant to modernization, and plagued by low morale among its sailors. While other world powers were investing in new battleship designs and advanced gunnery, Russia's fleet was a haphazard collection of often outdated vessels. The strategic planning was equally antiquated, and Alexei, more concerned with the pomp of his position than its perils, failed to address these critical flaws. He presided over a navy that was, in many ways, already defeated before it ever left port. The specific mission that would seal his disgrace was as audacious as it was ill-conceived. With the Japanese Navy blockading Russian forces in the Far East, the decision was made to send the Baltic Fleet, renamed the Second Pacific Squadron, on an unprecedented journey from the Baltic Sea all the way to the Pacific. The voyage itself was a 7-month ordeal of nearly 18,000 nautical miles, a punishing test of men and machinery. The fleet's passage was marred by international incident, most notoriously the Dogger Bank episode, where jumpy Russian gunners mistook a group of British fishing trawlers for Japanese torpedo boats and opened fire, nearly triggering a war with Great Britain. This incident painted the fleet as a dangerous, panicked laughingstock on the world stage, and the stress and exhaustion only mounted from there. By the time the ragged and weary Russian ships finally reached the Straits of Tsushima in May of 1905, they were not a formidable fighting force. They were an exhausted, demoralized convoy. The Japanese Navy, under the brilliant command of Admiral Togo, was the polar opposite: disciplined, modern, and possessing the supreme advantage of fighting close to its home waters. Togo had spent months drilling his crews and waiting. He knew the Russian route, and he prepared a devastating reception. The Battle of Tsushima was less a battle and more an annihilation. In a single day of firing, the Japanese fleet effectively destroyed the Russians. Of the 38 Russian ships that entered the strait, 21 were sunk, 7 were captured, 6 were interned in neutral ports, and only a handful managed to escape. Thousands of Russian sailors were killed or taken prisoner, while the Japanese lost only 3 small torpedo boats. It was the most decisive naval victory since Trafalgar a century before, and it completely shattered Russian naval power. For Grand Duke Alexei, safe in St. Petersburg, the news was a personal and professional obliteration. The press, which had once fawned over him, now excoriated him. He was lampooned in cartoons and blamed openly in the Duma. The title of General Admiral, once a mark of supreme honor, now hung around his neck like a millstone. In a regime already teetering on the brink of revolution after the events of Bloody Sunday, the defeat at Tsushima was a catalyst for widespread anger. The public and the military needed a scapegoat for this national humiliation, and all fingers pointed directly at the hedonistic, neglectful Grand Duke. The man who had enjoyed a life of pleasure and privilege while his navy rotted was held personally responsible for the thousands of lives lost and the empire's shattered prestige. The glittering world of the Tsarist court, once his playground, became a place of scorn and whispers. Under intense pressure from his nephew, Tsar Nicholas II, Alexei was forced to resign his post in disgrace. He was a royal prince without a purpose, publicly shamed and stripped of his power. It was in this context of profound disgrace that Alexei conceived of his escape to Alaska. Though the United States had purchased the territory from Russia in 1867, the region still held a powerful connection to the Russian aristocracy and represented a world away from the judgmental eyes of Europe. For Alexei, Spruce Island was more than a hunting lodge. It was a bunker for his shattered ego. The immense distance was the entire point. On that remote, frozen shore, he was no longer the disgraced admiral who lost a fleet. He could play the part of a rugged sportsman, a host, the master of a small, silent domain where the only sounds were the wind and the waves, and never the accusing whispers of a court that had cast him out. While the Astor fortune's origins in the opium trade reveal a global moral compromise, the family's enduring power was built much closer to home on a foundation of human suffering. The same John Jacob Astor who smuggled narcotics into China also pioneered a ruthless form of urban landlordism that would become the true, lasting engine of the Astor dynasty. His genius and his profound ethical failure was in recognizing that while furs and foreign trade could make a man rich, New York City real estate could make his family immortal. This vast and ever-growing portfolio of properties, however, was not comprised of the grand Fifth Avenue mansions they built for themselves. The dark secret underpinning their idyllic escapes to Mackinac Island was a sprawling, invisible empire of squalid, overcrowded tenements that exploited the very hopes of the immigrants flocking to America. Astor's strategy was brutally simple and incredibly profitable. He used the capital from his mercantile ventures to buy up vast swaths of undeveloped farmland on the then northern edges of Manhattan Island. He had the prescience to see the city's explosive growth coming. As the waves of German and Irish immigrants arrived in the mid-19th century, fleeing famine and political unrest, they desperately needed a place to live. Astor and his heirs were ready. They divided their land into tiny lots and leased them to speculative builders, who then erected the cheapest possible housing to maximize their return. These were the infamous dumbbell tenements, named for their shape, which was designed to create an air shaft between buildings, a pitiful concession to health codes that did little to alleviate the horrific conditions inside. The Astors, along with other wealthy families like the Golitz and the Rhinelanders, became absentee landlords on an industrial scale. They rarely, if ever, visited the properties that bore their name. Their involvement was purely financial, managed through agents who collected rents and enforced leases with an iron fist. The human cost of this business model was staggering. A single Astor-owned tenement building might house dozens of families in apartments that were dark, airless, and cramped. Multiple families often shared a single toilet in the building's courtyard, a source of rampant disease. Tuberculosis, cholera, and typhus festered in these damp, unventilated rooms. Children played in streets, overflowing with garbage and raw sewage because their homes offered no space for them. The immense profits from this human misery were nothing short of breathtaking. While a single tenement apartment might only yield a few dollars a month in rent, the scale was enormous. The Astors owned hundreds of these buildings. The rent rolls became a torrent of cash, a predictable, ever-increasing river of wealth that flowed from the poorest pockets in the city directly into the Astor coffers. This money was then reinvested to buy more land and build more tenements, creating a vicious, self-perpetuating cycle of exploitation. It was this model that allowed the family to transition from merchants into permanent landed gentry, their fortune no longer tied to the risky whims of global trade, but rooted in the very soil of the expanding city. The sheer hypocrisy of this double life is what makes it so jarring. As the Astor patriarchs counted their rent receipts from disease-ridden slums, they were also hosting grand summertime retreats on the pristine shores of Mackinac Island. They would travel north by private rail car and steamship to a world of crisp, clean air, sprawling lawns, and impeccable order. The Grand Hotel, with its famous porch and strict dress code, was the physical antithesis of a Lower East Side tenement. There, they could entertain politicians, artists, and other elites, presenting themselves as the epitome of civilized refinement and benevolent patronage. They donated to charities and built libraries, engaging in the very conspicuous virtue designed to whitewash the source of their riches. This brutal contrast reveals the ultimate dark secret of their Gilded Age. Their island paradise was not just purchased with profits from a forgotten opium trade. It was subsidized by the daily suffering of thousands of anonymous New Yorkers. The Astors could only afford to escape to their manicured idyll because they had first built a hidden urban hell. The tranquility of Mackinac was therefore the ultimate luxury, a state of mind achieved not merely through wealth, but through a willful, physical, and moral distance from the devastating human cost of acquiring it. Their private island wasn't just an escape from the city's noise. It was an escape from the consequences of their own actions, a sanctuary built on a foundation of silent, unseen tenants. The idyllic atmosphere of Neshobe Island, already strained by the constant clash of colossal egos, was shattered completely by a single tragic event that exposed the ugly reality festering beneath the witty banter. The victim was not one of the core roundtable members, but a visitor, an aspiring actress and socialite named Margalo Gilmore. She had come to the island for a weekend of brilliant conversation and high society glamour, a chance to bask in the reflected light of the celebrated wits. What happened next remains shrouded in a haze of conflicting accounts and deliberate obfuscation, a classic case of the powerful closing ranks to protect their own from scandal. The official story, the one carefully crafted for the authorities and the press, was a straightforward, if heartbreaking, accident. The tale told was of a moonlit evening, perhaps after a few too many cocktails, where Gilmore allegedly slipped on a moss-covered rock or a damp wooden step, suffering a fatal fall that cracked her skull. It was a plausible enough explanation for a remote island, a tragic mishap that could be met with solemn head-shaking and murmured condolences. But the whispers that immediately began circulating among the staff and the few islanders who ferried supplies told a starkly different story. These accounts suggested a far more volatile and culpable scenario, pointing the finger directly at the island's volatile monarch, Alexander Wolcott. According to these hushed testimonies, the evening had been particularly tense. Wolcott, never tolerant of what he perceived as dullness or intellectual inferiority, had been mercilessly needling his guest. His famous wit, so often celebrated in print, could be a venomous weapon in private. And that night, he allegedly unleashed a torrent of cruel, personal barbs aimed at Gilmore. The argument escalated, becoming more heated and personal. In a fit of rage, some versions claim Wolcott did not merely shout, but physically lashed out, perhaps giving her a sharp, dismissive shove. Whether he intended to cause harm or was just gesturing wildly in his fury, the result was the same. Gilmore lost her balance on the uneven ground and fell, striking her head with catastrophic force. The immediate aftermath was not a scene of panicked grief, but one of cold, calculated damage control. The first call was not to the local sheriff, but to the family's powerful lawyers. The priority was not justice, but containment. The island's isolation, once its greatest asset for creativity, now became its greatest asset for a cover-up. By the time any official investigation could be launched, the story had been meticulously sanitized. Witnesses among the staff were reportedly coached, their statements aligned with the official narrative of a simple, unfortunate accident. The potential for a massive scandal involving a famous critic, a beautiful young woman, and allegations of manslaughter was too great a threat to the reputations of everyone involved. The collective decision was made to bury the truth alongside Margalo Gilmore. This chilling act of self-preservation worked in the short term. The public story was one of a tragic accident, and the matter was officially closed. But the moral rot of that night seeped into the very soil of Neshobe and the soul of the Algonquin Round Table. For some members, like the fundamentally decent Harpo Marx and the sharp but principled Dorothy Parker, the cover-up was a line crossed. The group they had cherished for its irreverent honesty had revealed itself to be capable of a profound and cowardly dishonesty. The incident created an unbridgeable chasm of silence and suspicion. How could they sit across a lunch table at the Algonquin Hotel, trading barbs and bonds mots with Wolcott, knowing what they now knew? The trust that had been the glue of their fellowship was irrevocably broken. The laughter now sounded hollow, the wit felt mean-spirited and tainted. The death on Neshobe Island didn't just claim one life. It mortally wounded the spirit of the very circle that had made the island famous, proving that no amount of clever wordplay could conceal the stain of a secret this dark. But the legend of Yuzapa Island's concealed activities doesn't end with the whisper of smuggling rum. A far more sinister and persistent tale haunts its history, one that suggests the island's seclusion may have been used not just to hide contraband, but to conceal a crime. This is the chilling rumor of the disappearance of a business rival, a story that paints Baron Collier not just as a savvy capitalist, but as a man who might have used his private kingdom to permanently eliminate an obstacle in his path. To understand how such a dark theory could gain traction, we must consider the man Collier was and the cutthroat world he operated in. This was the Roaring Twenties, an era where business was often a brutal, no-holds-barred contest. Baron Collier had built his advertising empire through aggressive tactics and overwhelming force, securing monopolies and crushing competitors. He was a titan used to getting what he wanted, and his move into Florida land development was an extension of that same relentless ambition. He was buying entire towns, redirecting highways, and effectively creating a new county in his own name. In such a high-stakes environment, rivals would inevitably emerge, whether powerful men with their own visions for the state's future, men who might stand in the way of Collier's meticulously laid plans. The specifics of the story are murky, as all the best legends are, passed down through generations in hushed tones. The central figure is an unnamed or variously named business rival. In some versions, he is a fellow land speculator who is out maneuvering Collier for a crucial parcel of land. In others, he is a political figure who threatened to block the legislation Collier needed for a project, or perhaps a former partner who knew too much and was preparing to expose some of Collier's shadier dealings. The common thread is that this man posed a significant threat to Collier's empire. According to the tale, this rival was invited to Yuzapa Island for a meeting, presumably to discuss their differences or negotiate a deal. He arrived by boat, was seen being welcomed ashore by Collier's men, and then was never seen again. The island's geography makes the story terrifyingly plausible. Accessible only by water and patrolled by Collier's private security, it was a sealed environment. A single command from Collier could ensure that no one entered or left without his knowledge. The surrounding waters, teeming with sharks and strong currents, offered a perfect and permanent method of disposal. A body, weighted down, could vanish into the depths of the Pine Island Sound without a trace, leaving no evidence behind. There would be no independent witnesses, no police to call, and no one to question the official story, whatever that story might have been. The isolation that made it perfect for smuggling also made it the ideal setting for a murder. Of course, there is no police report, no missing persons file, and no concrete evidence to prove this story true. Baron Collier was far too powerful and too careful to allow such a thing to exist. Any official inquiry would have been met with a wall of silence from his loyal employees and a battalion of high-priced lawyers. The local law enforcement, which his tax dollars largely funded, would have had little incentive to dig too deeply into the affairs of their most powerful benefactor. The disappearance, if it happened, was effectively investigated by no one. This is why the legend endures. It fits the character of a man of immense, nearly unchecked power, and it fits the setting of a place designed to be impenetrable. It speaks to a deep-seated public suspicion that the colossal fortunes of the Gilded Age and the Roaring Twenties weren't just built on sharp business practices, but on a willingness to cross lines that others would not. The story of the vanished rival transforms Untold Island from a simple billionaire's retreat into something far more ominous. It becomes a symbol of the ultimate dark side of American capitalism, a place where the rules of civilization did not apply, and where a man's enemies could be made to simply cease to exist. It suggests that for Baron Collier, the ultimate use of his private island may not have been to hide barrels of whiskey, but to bury a secret that was far more human. The story of Rough Island's curse, passed down through generations of whispered legend, may not be the only secret its soil has been forced to keep. As the island changed hands over the centuries, each new aristocratic owner inherited not just the land, but also its powerful, marketable narrative of royal betrayal and supernatural vengeance. For one such owner in the late 19th century, the allure of this Gothic story may have become more valuable than historical truth itself, leading to a deliberate campaign to bury any evidence that contradicted the myth. This owner, a wealthy and status-obsessed peer with a deep fascination for the Stuart dynasty, is at the center of allegations involving a shocking archaeological cover-up, an act of historical vandalism meant to ensure the island's legacy remained one of romantic tragedy, not mundane reality. The first whispers of this intellectual crime began with the owner's own well-documented passion. He was an avid amateur historian and a devoted Jacobite sympathizer, a man who romanticized the lost cause of the Stuart kings. He published pamphlets and gave lectures on the island's curse, meticulously detailing the legend of the broken promise and the Forrester clan's sorrow. To him, the island was a sacred relic of a more noble, romantic past. This fervent belief, however, seems to have curdled into something far less scholarly when actual physical evidence began to emerge that challenged his preferred narrative. The trigger was likely a series of routine archaeological digs. In an era of growing interest in antiquities, it was common for estate owners to permit small-scale excavations, perhaps hoping to find evidence of the pirate treasure or medieval settlements mentioned in local lore. What they began to uncover, however, was far less dramatic, but historically significant. Digs around the site of the old main house and near the shoreline started turning up artifacts that pointed not to a grand aristocratic tragedy, but to a long, continuous, and surprisingly ordinary history of habitation. They found fragments of pottery and tools from much earlier periods, suggesting the island had been home to simple farmers and fishermen for centuries before the Stuarts ever laid claim to it. Crucially, evidence of a small religious community, perhaps a monastic cell, was reportedly unearthed, a discovery that would have firmly rooted the island's story in the quiet daily rhythms of faith and labor, not the thunderous dramas of kings and curses. For an owner whose entire identity was invested in the island's connection to royal betrayal, these finds were not exciting discoveries. They were a direct threat. They diluted the potency of his beloved legend with the boring truth of everyday life. The most damning allegations suggest that he ordered his workmen to quietly rebury these inconvenient artifacts. Pottery shards were tossed back into trenches and covered over. Stone foundations that didn't fit the timeline of the Stuart narrative were dismantled, and their stones repurposed for garden walls or simply dropped into the sea. The goal was not to destroy history outright, but to curate it, to selectively erase any elements that complicated the clean, powerful story he was selling to his guests and to the world. This alleged tampering extended beyond simple reburial. When the owner eventually commissioned a formal history of the island to be printed privately for his friends, the text was a masterpiece of omission. It heavily featured the curse and the royal connection, but it made no mention of the earlier archaeological finds that suggested a more complex past. Maps drawn under his supervision seemed to subtly shift the locations of certain historical sites, placing them in areas that better fit the legend rather than where the evidence actually indicated. He wasn't just hiding objects. He was reshaping the very landscape of the past to conform to his romantic fiction. The isolation of Rough Island was his greatest accomplice in this endeavor. With no independent scholars or government inspectors overseeing the work, he had total control over the narrative. He could decide what was found, what was documented, and ultimately, what was deemed true. The motivation for this appears to have been a toxic blend of ego and economics. A cursed island with a royal Stuart secret was a sensational draw. It attracted wealthy tourists, journalists, and fellow aristocrats, all eager to experience the haunting atmosphere for themselves. This not only boosted the owner's social status, but also enhanced the monetary value of his property. An island with a boring history of farmers and monks held little cachet. An island steeped in the blood of a betrayed clan was a priceless commodity. By sanitizing the archaeological record, he was protecting his investment and safeguarding his own self-fashioned identity as the guardian of a grand historical tragedy. In doing so, however, he committed a profound crime against history itself, ensuring that the true, layered story of Rough Island, the story of the common people who actually lived and died on its shores, might be lost forever, sacrificed on the altar of a more marketable myth. This magnetic pull toward isolation, this deep-seated belief that a moat of salt water could also be a moat of silence, reveals a fascinating and often flawed psychological blueprint shared by these powerful figures. It wasn't merely a preference for privacy. It was a calculated strategy rooted in a very human and often hubristic set of desires and delusions. At its core, the private island represents the ultimate expression of control for someone who is used to commanding everything in their orbit. On the mainland, even the wealthiest individual is subject to some external authority: local zoning laws, national taxes, the prying lens of a paparazzi camera from a public street. But on an island they wholly owned, they became the sole authority. They were the law, the government, and the sole witness. This absolute power creates a dangerous psychological cocktail where the normal checks and balances of society simply evaporate. This lack of witnesses is perhaps the most critical psychological factor. Human behavior is profoundly shaped by the possibility of being observed. It's the foundation of social conformity and moral restraint. Remove that possibility entirely, and the inhibitions that govern action can begin to dissolve. For a Grand Duke Alexei, the isolation of Spruce Island meant he could indulge his hedonistic lifestyle without a single critical glance from the courtiers who had scorned him. For the titans of industry on Jekyll Island, it meant they could redesign the American economy in a soundproof room. Utterly unaccountable to the public, their decisions would affect. The private island becomes a permission structure for behavior that would be scandalous, illegal, or ethically monstrous in a more connected environment. It fosters a mindset where the only morality that matters is their own, and the only consequences they fear are the ones they cannot control. This leads to a second powerful psychological driver: the illusion of invulnerability. There is a profound and ultimately false sense of security that comes from controlling every point of access. The billionaires on Indian Creek Island, with their private police force and drone jamming technology, operate under the assumption that they have successfully walled off not just people, but consequences itself. They believe their wealth has purchased them not just privacy, but impunity. This illusion is incredibly seductive. It convinces them that they can conduct illicit affairs, broker corrupt deals, or hide entire branches of their family tree without any risk of exposure. The island, in their minds, becomes a perfect vault. Yet history shows us repeatedly that this is a catastrophic miscalculation. The isolation that creates this false sense of security often becomes the very thing that amplifies their downfall. Without any dissenting voices or external perspectives, bad ideas fester, paranoia grows, and small deceptions balloon into life-shattering scandals. The Vanderbilt's Fisher Island was meant to be a secluded love nest, but its very separateness allowed the Fishers in their marriage to widen in the echo chamber of their own making, until the truth exploded outward in the most public way possible. The Gardiner family's belief that their island could contain their curses only made the tragedies within its borders feel more concentrated and devastating. The isolation doesn't protect them, it magnifies their mistakes, turning personal failings into isolated cataclysms. They fail to realize that while they can control the physical access to their world, they cannot control the human emotions, the jealousies, the betrayals, or the simple bad luck that exists within it. The moat keeps the world out, but it also locks their darkest secrets in with them, creating a pressure cooker that inevitably detonates. In seeking to become untouchable, they often make themselves far more vulnerable, building the perfect stage for their own most spectacular undoing. Today, many of these once impenetrable private kingdoms have been transformed, their gates thrown open to the public. The very walls that guarded their owners' darkest secrets now display placards detailing their polished, tourist-friendly histories. Jekyll Island is a beloved Georgia state park where families bike past the Grand Jekyll Island Club Hotel, completely unaware that the path they're on was once trod by bankers secretly redesigning the American economy. Visitors can even take a tour called the Millionaire's Village, a sanitized walk through the glamour, with no mention of the racial policies or eugenic philosophies those millionaires may have discussed in its rooms. Mackinac Island thrives on its charming, frozen-in-time aesthetic, with horse-drawn carriages and fudge shops lining the streets, a far cry from the tenement slums that funded the Astore's summer retreats. The Grand Hotel markets itself on a legacy of elegance, carefully sidestepping the opioid misery that built its famous porch. This repackaging of history is a fascinating and perhaps necessary form of collective amnesia. The dark, complex truths of these places have been sanded down into palatable narratives of Gilded Age opulence and romantic ruin. The emotional weight of a displaced community, the silent agony of a secret family, the whispered plot in a secluded library. These are not easy stories to sell tickets for. They are messy, uncomfortable, and force us to confront the human cost of extreme wealth and isolation. So we are offered a simpler story, one of grand parties, elegant fashions, and picturesque decay. We become tourists in someone else's gilded cage, admiring the view, but never truly sensing the desperation that once festered behind the beauty. Yet, the whispers of the past have a stubborn way of persisting. On Gardiners Island, which remains in private hands but is subject to more public scrutiny, the family's alleged curse is now a central part of its mystique, a story told with a wink, even as it speaks to a very real history of tragedy. The dark hedges in Northern Ireland became a global sensation purely because of their ghost story, their eerie beauty drawing thousands of visitors who may not know the Stewart family's name, but can feel the melancholy embedded in the landscape. The most powerful secrets are not always the ones deliberately hidden. Sometimes they are the truths that a place cannot help but express, no matter how many guidebooks try to cover them with a veneer of glamour. The real history is still there, buried just beneath the surface of the manicured lawns and restored buildings, waiting for anyone willing to listen a little closer to the stories the tour guides won't tell. And so, across these scattered islands, from the icy shores of Alaska to the sun-drenched coasts of Florida, a single, haunting pattern emerges. The dream of a private paradise, purchased with unimaginable wealth, consistently curdles into a nightmare of isolation. We see it in the Gardiner family's ancient curse, born from a pirate's greed and perpetuated by generations of tragedy. We see it in the cold, calculated secrecy of Jekyll Island, where a handful of men redesigned a nation's economy without a single citizen's knowledge. The Vanderbilt's Fisher Island became the trophy in a humiliating divorce, while the Astore's Mackinac retreat was built on a foundation of urban misery and a fortune from addiction. The Gullah people of Dafusky were displaced for a billionaire's playground, and the tragic ghost of the dark hedges wanders because of a family's rigid pride. These are not isolated incidents of bad luck. They are the logical outcome of a world without witnesses, where immense privilege creates a vacuum for scandal, hidden crimes, and profound moral compromise. The recurring theme is that the very thing these powerful figures sought, absolute seclusion, became their greatest vulnerability. The walls they built to keep the world out ended up trapping their darkest impulses inside, allowing betrayal, corruption, and cruelty to fester away from any prying eyes that might have provided a check or a conscience. Their wealth bought them the power to create their own realities, but it could not buy them wisdom or happiness. Instead, it often amplified their flaws, turning personal failings into dynastic catastrophes and business ambitions into systemic injustices. These islands stand as permanent monuments to the dark side of extreme wealth, revealing a universal truth that no amount of money can silence a guilty conscience, and that a gilded cage is still a cage, no matter how perfect the view. The stories we've uncovered are likely just the beginning. For every scandal that has boiled over into public view, how many more remain buried in the sand or hidden behind yet another private security gate? The history of these islands is written in whispers, and we've only just learned how to listen. So we want to turn it over to you. What secrets do you think are still hidden on the world's private islands? Which modern enclave of the ultra-wealthy do you believe holds a story waiting to be told? Share your thoughts and theories in the comments below. We love reading them. And if you enjoyed this journey into the heart of Gilded Secrets, make sure to subscribe and hit the bell for more deep dives into the histories they never taught you in school.